On the morning of April 6, 1933, America woke up to an eerie silence. Something no one could have imagined had happened. Before the day had even begun, millions of Americans found themselves turned into criminals without realizing it. The gold that sat in their pockets the night before had suddenly become something that could send a person to prison for 10 years. No trial, no police knocking on doors. Just one signature had turned not only the country's but the entire world's most trusted asset into a banned substance. So how did the very source of wealth for a free nation become a target of the law overnight? At that time, America was entering one of the darkest periods in its history after that signature. The Great Depression had swept across the country like a black shadow and extinguished everything. It was so massive that factories shut down, banks collapsed, people lost their homes, their cars, their jobs, their futures. Newspapers wrote every day that hundreds of banks across the country were closing, and on the streets, you could clearly see the fear on people's faces. In times like these, people run to the safest harbor they know. And in 1933 America, that safe harbor was gold. Gold was doing what the dollar, devalued and weakened, could no longer do. It was giving people a breath of relief. That's why most Americans, no matter how little money they had, were hiding a small amount of gold. But President Roosevelt didn't see gold the way the public saw it. For the people, gold was safety. But for Roosevelt, instead of being a safe harbor, it was like a hidden hand choking the economy. Because since 1879, America had been running its financial life under the classical gold standard. What did that mean? Every unit of money needed to be backed by real physical gold sitting in the treasury. But America didn't have enough gold to print the money it needed. For the government of the time, this was like a tightening rope around its throat. There simply wasn't enough gold. Yes, the system had worked for many years because people trusted the dollar knowing it was backed by metal. But the system had a hidden weakness, one no one took seriously because it had never been tested. If everyone asked for their gold at the same time, the system would collapse. And the 1929 stock market crash triggered exactly that. As the market fell apart, everyone rushed to hold gold, the safe haven. Because in crises and collapses, gold becomes the most valuable and universally accepted asset. Right after the crash, as banks across the country began failing one after another, panic grew. People ran to the banks to withdraw their savings, not paper dollars, but real gold. At first, banks met this demand. But over time, gold reserves shrank a little more each day, and without gold, the country's economy was dying. By 1933, America's gold reserves had reached a critical level, the line between survival and collapse. If things continued for just a few more months, the dollar's link to gold would break completely. The financial system would collapse, and the government would fall to its knees, weak, exposed, and possibly erased from history. At exactly this point, Roosevelt stepped in. To reverse this downward spiral and defeat the Great Depression, he believed only one radical, but in his view necessary, action remained, taking the gold from the hands of the public and transferring it to the state. Because he knew he couldn't get the gold he needed from wars, spoils, or mines. He knew he couldn't find it anywhere else. And the only option left was to set his eyes on the gold that ordinary people were holding. But he couldn't implement such a radical decision by politely asking. Because no one on earth would willingly hand over their gold. So Roosevelt signed one of the most controversial and radical decisions in history. And overnight, he changed the rules of the entire financial system. Executive Order 6102. The official name of the document sounded fancy. What was this order? The prohibition of hoarding gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates. But the real content was much harsher, and if you condense the entire order, the summary was this. Everyone will surrender all the gold they own to the government within 25 days. Were there exceptions? Yes, but so small they were almost laughable. Items like jewelry, rings, necklaces, dental fillings. Apart from that tiny category, anyone holding gold would be considered a criminal and prosecuted under federal law. Aside from that, the free market was gone. No more open gold trading. The price of gold would be whatever the government said it was, and the government intentionally set that price far below the real value to fix its own situation. But the real shock came 1 year later, because after the government collected the gold, they raised the price by almost double, meaning the public handed over their gold cheaply, the government increased the price and pocketed the difference, along with the elite wealthy who benefited from this environment. This decision became the beginning of the largest transfer of wealth, gold and money, from the hands of the people into the pockets of the government and the privileged in American history. From the very first day this strategy began, millions of Americans were turned into criminals without even understanding what was happening. Gold was, in a way, the oxygen that kept the money system alive. But the amount of this oxygen, the gold, was limited. And as society grew, as the economy needed more, as government expenses naturally increased in a growing system, this oxygen was no longer enough. Just like a child entering adolescence needs better, higher quality nutrition to grow healthy, a growing nation needed more gold, and that gold wasn't increasing. Its insufficiency was limiting development. Think of this with a simple example: trying to supply water to a town of 5,000 people using a 50-year-old pipe system. Systems are never designed to operate at 100% capacity, but the moment everyone turns on their faucet at the same time, the system fails and serves no one. The gold standard, like the link between paper dollars and physical gold, was exactly like this. Paper dollars were circulating, but the gold that backed them was just sitting there in vaults, and the gold in those vaults could no longer meet the needs of the growing economy. The economy wanted to grow, but the lack of gold was blocking it. Banks wanted to give more loans. Companies wanted more capital to invest. The government needed more funding. Everyone wanted growth, but it simply wasn't possible. And the question stuck in everyone's mind was, is there enough gold in the vault to back all this money? During the World Wars, the answer was very often no. Usually the answer was, there isn't. And the Great Crash of 1929 exposed this fragile system completely. While everyone expected growth, the lack of gold halted money flow, collapsed the market, and bank balance sheets began to rupture. From today's perspective, you might think, why didn't the government just print money, inject liquidity, restart the economy? A fair modern question, but today's rules apply to today's system, not to the rules of the past. Under the gold standard, that wasn't possible. No matter how much the government wanted to print money, every new dollar needed physical gold behind it. And that gold simply didn't exist, so they couldn't print money. And that gold was melting away a little more every single day, because investors and foreign governments didn't want dollars, they wanted gold. Banks normally had enough gold reserves to last for years, but the system was so tight that within a few months the reserves dropped to dangerous levels. Because just like in the faucet example, everyone started demanding their gold at the same time. This exposed another problem. When gold decreases, the dollar becomes more valuable. Yes, that's true. It sounds like good news, but it brings serious dangers with it. How? Because the abnormal rise in the dollar's value means economic disaster. The economy is built on balances. One imbalance triggers the next. And as we said, when the dollar gains value, debts grow, loans shrink, investment stops, businesses contract, production falls, meaning the economy slowly slows down and eventually begins to freeze. This freezing effect is called deflation. Deflation means the heart of an economy slowly stopping. Roosevelt understood this exactly. As the gold in the vault decreased, the dollar became more valuable. And as the dollar gained value, the economy shrank even more. This was something that might be manageable slowly over time. But happening suddenly destroyed all plans. There was only one radical way to stop this: breaking the chain that tied the dollar to physical gold. But breaking that chain meant this: the government would take the least damage, and the people would pay the highest price. What was the condition? Every ounce of gold in the market had to be under government control, because if people continued holding their gold, and many small and large strategies were tried, but none of them worked, and the gold in the public's hands wasn't entering circulation, then trust in the new dollar system would collapse, the old system would be called back, and Roosevelt's plan would fail before it even began. So Roosevelt's goal was not to completely ban gold. His goal was to pull every citizen's gold into the center and use it to break the dollar's chains and stop deflation. What if there wasn't enough gold in the government vaults? They couldn't devalue the dollar, meaning they couldn't reduce the dollar's overly high value. They couldn't increase money supply. They couldn't revive the frozen economy. They couldn't ease the debt burden. And on top of that, they would have to borrow even more. Roosevelt saw this reality and, painful in the short term but necessary for long-term recovery, made his decision. The only way to save the economy is to nationalize gold and bring it under government control. Implementing this decision was, of course, not easy. There was opposition and heavy criticism, but the decision wasn't made out of desire, it was made out of necessity. Because the amount of gold the public held was far greater than what the government had, and if the public didn't surrender their gold willingly and the government couldn't reach it, the economy wouldn't reopen and would collapse. And so, the foundation for the move that would change America's monetary history forever was set. Only one step remained: signing Executive Order 6102 and enduring everything that would come with it: the resistance, the backlash, the consequences. So how did Roosevelt implement this move? Did the public accept the system, or did some resist? Executive Order 6102, despite its sharp and cold official title, carried the force of a scalpel slicing through America's daily life. In short, it ordered, "You will surrender all the gold you own to the government within 25 days. Anyone who does otherwise is a criminal." But the order didn't end there. The deeper you go into its details, the clearer it becomes how strict and escape-proof it really was. This is what the order contained: not just gold bars, not just coins, not just bank certificates. The order covered the following: gold coins, double eagle, eagle, half eagle, quarter eagle, gold bullion, gold certificates, any form of gold ownership kept in vaults or held in banks. It was defined so broadly that it even covered almost anything containing gold or connected to gold, to the point where many items that would normally be considered completely private property, decorative pieces, or personal ornaments, were now almost entirely within the scope. The only exceptions were wedding rings as personal jewelry, dental fillings for medical use, a few rare coins with high collectible value, very small gold pieces used in industrial production. Everything outside of these exceptions was now something the state wanted to sweep up, every form of gold that carried real economic weight, and bring it into government hands to release into the economy as needed. So what were the penalties for not complying with this order? If you don't surrender it, people would pay a very heavy price: a $10,000 fine or up to 10 years in prison, or both. This might not look huge by today's standards, but to compare properly, in 1933, $10,000 was equal to 6 years of the average worker's salary. For gold, it was an extremely high penalty. Anyone refusing to surrender their gold would end up paying a price much greater than the gold they were trying to keep. And in a society already economically broken, psychologically exhausted, people were now also treated like criminals for no reason. The penalties were so severe that it was nearly impossible for a family man to accumulate such an amount. The purpose of these penalties was crystal clear: don't even think about escaping, hand over what you have. The government wanted this gold, peacefully or by force, it didn't matter. Gold was its only way out. But Roosevelt knew that taking it through fear or force alone wouldn't fully work. He needed one more move. So he did this. The great propaganda machine was activated. For the first time in their history, Americans entered a period where their own property could be labeled a crime. To manage this psychological fracture, one of the most aggressive propaganda campaigns in history was launched. Newspapers constantly pushed messages like, "Keeping gold is an act of treason." Radio broadcasts across the entire country repeated the same tone, "Surrendering your gold is helping America recover." Posters at bank entrances read, "Turn in your gold, save America. Your duty, lift the economy. Hoarding gold is selfish." The propaganda was so constant, so frequent, and so well crafted that a new equation began forming in people's minds. Gold equals not the property of the people, but of the state. Hiding gold equals harming the country, and therefore a crime. This psychological operation aimed not just at fear, but at creating a form of moral pressure. The campaign went so far that some people began to see gold hoarders not just as criminals, but as enemies of society. How did the government collect this gold? Banks became collection centers. You walk into the bank, you hand over your gold, you receive paper dollars at the government's fixed price. The bank immediately transfers your gold to the Federal Reserve System. There was no negotiation, no objection. Everyone, to avoid being labeled a criminal, was forced to surrender gold at a fixed price far below its real value. The public reaction? Shockingly minimal. The propaganda worked so well that despite complaints, there was no large-scale uprising, no major protests, no widespread resistance. People simply muttered under their breath. Many even stood in line thinking, "I'm doing the right thing for my country." What was actually happening didn't even cross anyone's mind, because no one knew that just a few months later the government would reprice gold and make an enormous profit from this massive wealth it had bought so cheaply. Executive Order 6102 wasn't just a government rescue operation, it was also the beginning of one of the largest economic transfers of wealth in history. Gold was being taken from the public and moved into someone else's pockets. So how much gold did the government actually collect? And more importantly, what did the government do with this gold? Who profited from it? Under the pressure of propaganda and harsh penalties, people didn't just walk. They flowed into banks with not grams, but literally tons of gold. The biggest wealth transfer in history was happening right before their eyes, but almost no one realized it, except a small handful. Because these things are done quietly, behind closed doors, in silence. Once Executive Order 6102 began to be enforced, banks collected the gold and immediately transferred it to federal facilities, and from there it was sent to special refineries to be melted down. The amount of gold produced, melted, in the 6 years following the order, 265 metric tons. And this was only the melted portion. The total amount of gold surrendered, including corporate holdings and individual assets, was 3,673 tons of gold. Roosevelt had finally obtained exactly what he wanted. Gold that he knew existed in far greater quantity in private hands than in the national treasury. To understand the scale, a few comparisons help. More than Russia's gold reserves, nearly equal to China's modern gold reserves. Over 8 million pounds of raw gold, worth roughly $400 billion at today's prices. There is an even darker, more secretive story here, about hidden hands and gold disappearing into unknown places. But that is another story. In the end, Roosevelt got the gold he wanted. The gold-backed economic system finally loosened its chains. The system was relieved, not the people. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that systems and the elites they protect are always rescued first, and those crushed beneath it, the ordinary people, lose what is theirs. And the truth is this: the future of a nation can be completely changed by a single decision made in one night, just like in 1933. And history repeats itself. If you liked it or found it helpful, you can subscribe, like, or share. The choice is yours. See you in the next video.